Bumps in the night, ghosts and ghouls, vampires and werewolves. Throw in a mad scientist, psycho killer out for revenge, and then add in the social fears and imperfections, and the recipe is even more enticing. Hello, I'm Brian Ingram, digital cinematography student here at Full Sail University. Prepare yourself for a chilling tale of the frightening and the unknown. This is a brief history and evolution of the horror film genre. Horror films have been around since the beginning of the film. From the first horror film on record, to the granddaddy of all horror films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, to the first vampire film, Nosferatu. The genre has always been a way for us as an audience to be scared. And what could be scarier than blood-sucking vampires? And with the advent of sound, the horror movie was born again in the 1930s. Now we could hear the screams, and the music seemed to change to fit the genre better as well. The 30s also brought forth some of the classic movie monsters, such as Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy. And this trend would continue into the 40s with Werewolf of London and The Wolfman, as well as other monster movie classics. And with World War II now over, the introduction of the atomic bomb, we now began to see the advent of the creature feature. Mutants would run wild over our screens. Godzilla, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Them, any of those ring a bell? The 1950s saw a blend of the horror genre with the science fiction genre. We were in the middle of the Cold War, and many of our fears were incorporated into the films of the time, along with other social problems of the era. The 1960s and 70s saw another blend. This time it was the horror and the thriller, and no one blended the two together better than the man himself, Alfred Hitchcock. His influence can still be seen throughout many of today's movies. And while zombie movies have made an appearance earlier in film history, the modern zombie was the brainchild of George A. Romero, and many of Romero's movies generally took a shot at the imperfections of society. The mid to late 1970s also brought forth the slasher films, and many of these films would lead to some of the popular cliches that would fill most of the horror genre today. Texas Chainsaw Massacre and John Carpenter's Halloween were just the beginning. The 1980s continued with slasher films. A lot of the cliches we see today were prevalent in the films of this era. The slasher film also seemed to want to punish teenagers for their wrongdoings. Smoking, drinking, and unmarried sex seemed to be pet peeves of the bad guys in these films. If you did any of those, you were going to pay for it in the end. The 1990s and beyond seem no different, and many of today's horror films still include the punishment of wrongdoing teenagers. There was an attempt to bring back the slasher film in the 90s with films such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, but something else, hiding deep in the shadows, was coming for us. The paranormal has always been a part of the horror genre, but seemingly it has increased over the last several years. With such movies as The Blair Witch Project, Cloverfield, The Ring, and The Conjuring, not to mention Paranormal Activity and its sequels, the ghosts have seemed to take over the genre. The horror film has been with us since the beginning. We all have this strange desire to be frightened, whether we're willing to admit it or not. And as long as there are real threats, such as nuclear war, ghosts in our houses, or even vampires lurking in the shadows, there will be that horror film to satisfy our hunger.